All right, good morning and welcome back to another Friday morning webinar. This week we have Nufarm. So we've got Tanner, Tyler, and Evan from Nufarm here to present some of their products. So with that, I will let them take it away and I will stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us on here. We appreciate it there, Lyle. I'm Tyler Gullen, Technical Services Manager for the Western Prairies for Nufarm. So be chatting a little bit today about a few things, coming into the spring here and kind of some, ways to help manage challenging weeds or resistant weeds, whatever it is that you're struggling with on your particular acres there. So I'm gonna just kill the video here to save a little bit of bandwidth here. But when we'll jump into it. So I think just to talk a little bit about it, I want to get into just touch briefly on kind of herbicide resistance and, as well as duplicin and, just kind of a unique active for helping manage some of the challenging weeds that you're dealing with, whether it's, kochia or whatever it is in your neck of the woods. A little bit on some different approaches to try and control those, challenging weeds, then kind of how we can kind of put that all together to help control whatever's out there. So I guess we'll start just a question to think about there. We've heard lots over the years about, how to delay herbicide resistance and using multiple modes of action and rotating herbicide groups and, all those really good best practices that we can have to help, slow down resistance. But just, curious what your thoughts are on which is better at delaying resistance. Is it rotating herbicide groups? Is it using herbicides as multiple modes of action? Or they both work the same? So, I don't I think everyone's muted here, but just to think about it yourself. It's kind of interesting if you think about this, is Hugh Becky with Ag Canada before he went to Australia was did some of this work and basically showed that, pick any herbicide you want, whether it's, say Refine and 2,4-D, just something that, people have used over the years, but just pick any random herbicides A and B here. If you were just to use that herbicide on any acre repeatedly once a year, every year back to back, it only takes about 5 to 6 years for that herbicide to, completely break down and no longer work on the weeds in that field anymore. If you were to rotate those herbicides, so, spraying herbicide A this year, spraying herbicide B next year, and rotating back and forth in that same acre, you can stretch that out to about, call it 10, 11, 12 years before both those herbicides are no longer going to be effective on that acre. But if you actually mix them together in the same jug and have that multiple modes of action, in that same jug, in that same sprayer, you can actually do that same mixture back to back every year, and it'll stretch it out to about 14 or 15 years before it'll start to become ineffective on that acre. So, it's just kind of an interesting concept that's really driven a lot of the Nufarm portfolio and development in the last decade or whatever it's been here, and really making sure that we're getting multiple effective modes of action in every jug every time to really help do what we can to delay some of that herbicide resistance. And it's kind of interesting, kind of why that works or why that works out that way. So if you look at the back of your crop protection guide, there'll be this little triangle that shows the relative risk of different modes of action to developing herbicide resistance within the weeds that we have anywhere in Western Canada. So, the certain herbicide groups like groups 1 and 2 are going to be relatively high risk of developing resistance versus some of these other like the 4s, glyphosate, glufosinate, are going to be in some of that lower risk of developing herbicide resistance. So the actual numbers to it, something like a group 2, about 1 in 100,000 plants of any species are just going to have that natural background resistance, or mutation that confers resistance to group 2s, versus something like a glyphosate where it's about 1 in 100 million have a risk of developing that herbicide resistance. So there's always going to be a risk. Any selection pressure you put on any population, there's going to be somewhat of a risk to that resistance. It's never going to be zero, but there's just certain groups or certain molecules that are a little more susceptible than others. So it's interesting when you start to do the math on this. I'm a math guy. At least I find it interesting is, if you assume that pick any weed that you have in your fields, and if you assume there's 2 of them per square foot across a quarter section, kind of what these numbers mean is, if you look at how many resistant weeds are going to be potentially left after one herbicide application, 2 weeds per square foot is probably a pretty fair or common, density to have. If you actually work out that math, there's about 7 million square feet in a quarter. So with that 2 plants per square feet, these about, call it 14 million plants across that quarter. And if you were to go out with just that straight group two, say you'd never sprayed a group two on that field before from, any chemistry group, uh, that 1 in 100,000 risk of resistance development translates into about 140 plants in that quarter that are going to be, just have that natural resistance to that herbicide the very first time you go and spray that. If you never sprayed glyphosate before and came out of that, that it's a lot fewer plants that you'd have across that quarter. It'd be, less than one, it's kind of considered. So it's not zero, but just would have fewer plants left after that first application. Where this gets really interesting is that, what happens when you mix those together is these numbers multiply out. So, if you were to say take that group two and mix it with glyphosate and have that in the tank together, that risk goes from about 1 in 100,000 with that straight group two to about 1 in, what is that, 10 trillion. That's, going to show we're going to have that background mutation to both of those. If you can mix different modes of action that are a little lower on that pyramid of resistance development, all of a sudden, whether it's a group 6 and a group 9, that number ends up getting a lot smaller, or a lot bigger number, meaning a lot smaller chance of having that herbicide resistance. And even better if you can do multiple, modes of action. So something like a gold wing that's going to have that group 4, 14, and with glyphosate together, or, something like a Conquer 2 that's got the, bromoxynil group 14 and mixed with glyphosate as well. You end up with, about 1 in, I think it's 100 septillion is I think what this number actually is, which is interestingly enough, there's about, the number I found on Google was that that's about the same number of grains of sand there are on the earth. So the more you can kind of combine into that tank and in that product, get more modes of action onto that acre, your number never gets down to zero, but it just becomes a lot, less likely that you're going to have that herbicide resistance develop. And if you think about that, what happens to that number if, say that's your pre-burn, you've gone out with your Goldwing, and you come back in with in that in crop and spray some different modes of action in crop, you add some soil residuals into the mix, do things like that. These numbers start to just get astronomically big in terms of, slowing down that herbicide resistance. So kind of, just wanted to present that as a background because obviously there is a lot of, resistance going on. And, Nufarm's an Australian company. And, what they're dealing with in Australia is wild radish. It's kind of their, weed that they're really struggling with resistance there. So, it's resistant to the group twos, so they used to use 2,4-D to control it a lot, but it's become resistant to that, getting glyphosate resistance, some like the HPPD resistance, things like that. So, they were really struggling with this and kind of what happens when they, treat some of these wild radish plants and make these cool little radio labeled studies. What used to happen, you'd put that drop of 2,4-D on that wild radish plant, it would translocate down to the roots and, kill that plant at the root. What they're kind of finding with some of these resistant populations is that, when they add that 2,4-D molecule in there, it was looking more like something like this, where you get, was kind of getting just sequestered into that leaf, not getting down into the roots and not able to kill that plant. So, they're really struggling to figure out something, they could use to help control these wild radish plants. And what they came up with was this molecule called dupilsam. So, this is just the chemistry of it. I'm no chemist, but to me that looks really similar to 2,4-D, and it actually is. So it's the propanoic acid form of 2,4-D, just another form of 2,4-D. But what they were kind of finding was when they took that dupilsam and put it on those wild radish populations, it was starting to look something more like this, where it was translocating back down to the plants. And even though the 2,4-D wasn't working on these wild radish populations anymore, the dupilsam was still effective. So, obviously really excited, get a different, a different group 4 product, really similar to all the benefits of 2,4-D, in terms of, controlling different weeds and things like that, but also seemed to just be working in these weeds and in a different way, compared to 2,4-D. So that was really interesting. The other interesting thing about dupilsam is it's actually been around for a really long time in the world. It's like we've known about it for decades. It's just never really gone out on its own. It's always kind of been in mixtures with other things at, kind of a low rate just to to help out some of the other products in there. But it has been registered even in Canada in some different products. So we wanted to take a look at that in Canada. And obviously wild radish isn't a big concern for us, but that wild radish is really similar to kochia, where that 2,4-D just isn't working on kochia anymore in Western Canada. The group twos aren't working anymore. Glyphosate's not working anymore in a lot of cases. So we wanted to test that in kochia in Western Canada, see if we saw the same thing. So this is just a test that we did a few years back of, A is the untreated, B here is a group two, C is glyphosate, D is 2,4-D. So, this is what's becoming common in Western Canada where, the group twos and glyphosate and 2,4-D aren't working anymore. This blue box over here is that Duplosan, and same kind of thing that they were seeing in Australia with wild radish. That's we were still seeing that despite 2,4-D not working anymore and some of these other herbicides, that Duplosan was still working on those populations. So obviously really exciting for Western Canada where we're really struggling with some of that kochia. So and the interesting thing being is that because this is a similar molecule to 2,4-D in a lot of ways, it's still getting a lot of the same benefits where this was just a trial where we had some volunteer canola seeded into a kochia patch and fluroxypyr has worked really well on kochia, but it's just a different kind of chemistry that's not going to have activity on something like volunteer canola versus that Duplosan that's still controlling that volunteer canola as well as having that kochia activity. So just getting a lot of the benefits of some of those phenoxies like 2,4-D and Duplosan in there as well. The other cool thing is it is acting a little bit different than 2,4-D in other ways. So 2,4-D, we have to wait to the four-leaf stage to spray safely in wheat, or else you start to get some head deformities, things like that. But what we actually found is going a little earlier, so it's kind of a three-leaf crop stage where that 2,4-D was causing those deformed heads is really commonly well known. That Duplosan just acting a little bit different where we weren't seeing that those deformed heads. So it's just kind of another interesting aspect where it was working a little differently than 2,4-D. So we've launched a few products with that Duplosan in Western Canada. The first one last year was Oxbow. So that's that Duplosan bromoxynil. I talked earlier about how Nufarm really tries not to put out herbicides on their own. We always want to make sure there's kind of multiple effective modes of action in there. So that Duplosan is paired with bromoxynil in Oxbow. It's registered in spring wheat, durum wheat, winter wheat, and barley. And as mentioned, you can go as early as the three-leaf stage in those spring cereals, which is another nice benefit to it. There is a rate range on the label. The standard rate is the K Street's 40 acres. There is a higher rate. You can go down to 30 acres if you want, but 99% of the time, that 40-acre rate works really well as that kind of lower rate is standard. It is registered at 5 to 10 gallons an acre water volume. Because this bromoxynil is a contact-only herbicide, we do really like it to go at 10 gallons whenever possible. It just makes that bromoxynil work that much better, just get better weed control with that better coverage. And we do support tank mixes with Epic and Signal, which are two of our graminicides, as well as Varo, Simplicity, and it's not on here yet, but Everest as well on there too. The other nice thing about being kind of this group 4 and 6 herbicide is there are no recrop restrictions the year after application too. So just seen really nice results with a lot of different kochia populations where some of the herbicides on their own aren't working as well anymore. But that Oxbow has been working well on a lot of the it does work on a lot of different weeds as well. If you're not used to seeing kind of these spiderweb charts, the farther to the outside this line is, the better the control. And the number of the brackets is the number of data points that's based on. So works really well on things like cleavers and lamb's quarter and wild buckwheat and volunteer canola and wild mustard and a lot of our common weeds in Western Canada. So I just threw in a few pictures because it's fun looking at pictures of dead weeds. Evan and Tanner asked me to also just touch on this, kind of compared to Enforcer D. I know that in your neck of the woods, there's a lot of Enforcer D that goes out. And in my mind, this is, kind of the comparison to them is the Oxbow in your kind of area down in southern Alberta there, I do kind of think of Oxbow more of kind of like a kochia specialist. It obviously works well on a lot of different weeds, but it's just got that different mode of action in there that it's a little refreshing down in kochia country. Um, that being said, we do really like to get the weeds when they're small. Ideally get them kind of before they're a 3 inch stage cut or 4 inches or less. Ideally in kind of that 2 to 3 inch stage, you're going to get the better activity out of it. If things are starting to get a little larger, Enforcer D probably tends to be a little bit better. You still can't push it too far by any means, but kind of those larger weeds, or if you've got some of these other weeds that Ferox appears really strong on, like a volunteer flax or a stork's bill or something like that, that Enforcer D is going to be kind of probably a better option. That being said, Oxbow does generally work well on the vast majority of weeds out there, but if and 95% of the time works really well on its own. But if you've got specific weeds out there, there is an option to add other things to that. Whether it's you can top it up with a bit of fluroxypyr for things like if you have that volunteer flax or stork's bill or something like that, or a couple ounces of 2,4-D if you're kind of getting some bigger canola, things like that, or a group 2 if you want to throw it in for something like a narrowleaf hawksbeard. There are other options to kind of spice it up a little bit as well. Again, Oxbow generally works really well on its own, doesn't need these. There's just kind of some unique situations. It does work really well, on Kochia. I do like to promote, though it's by no means a silver bullet. It's kind of meant to be incorporated with other best practices too. So this is a situation last year where kind of before and after application, and in this case, it did work fairly well. It's a little tough to tell in the picture. Is a lot of green that's poking up there as well. And work good, but man, would have ever worked better if you had layered this with some Blackhawk EVO or some Fierce or Valterra or something like that beforehand to get some of these populations under control before coming back in with the Oxbow would have just been that much sharper kind of before it got to be such a mess. So just I'd like to promote that as well. The other product came out in was this Blackhawk EVO. So you're going to start to see, some renovations to our pre-seed burn down portfolio as well. Traditionally we've had Conquer and Goldwing and Blackhawk and Thunderhawk, all of which still work really well. But Blackhawk's the one that we've kind of evolved first with adding some Duplosan in. So if you've used Blackhawk in the past, it's this Group 14 pyroflufen as well as a Group 4 2,4-D, mainly used before cereals in Western Canada. So it's a pre-seed burn down prior to cereals. And with Blackhawk EVO, we've basically the previous Blackhawk was 5 ounces of 2,4-D, and we've basically cut that in half and gone 2.5 ounces of 2,4-D and 2.5 ounces of Duplosan. The reason being is just that putting those two together, just there's some weeds that one or the other is better between 2,4-D and Duplosan. We kind of found doing our research when you put them together, it just really makes it that much better. It seems to shine on both those weeds where one or the other works better. So it is 80 acres a case. If you've used the former Blackhawk product, it was 60 acres a case. So I just like to highlight that. So this is now 80 acres a case. And we kind of compare that previous Blackhawk to Blackhawk EVO, across, call it, I think it was 25 weeds here in Western Canada. The control is really comparable between the two of them. So you might be wondering, why would you do this if it's just going to be the same? But when you break out specific weeds, especially something like a kochia, these are some of our trials where, 2,4-D on its own just doesn't cut it on kochia anymore in Western Canada. There's just a bit of an insensitivity to it now. That pyroflufen, that Group 14 is a contact-only herbicide, so it's going to work really well when the weeds are small, but if they're starting to get a little bigger, it's going to start to slip a little bit, just the nature of contact herbicides, versus that Duplosan that's still working really well on those kochia populations that we're testing. So we kind of put that all together. Blackhawk on its own used to work really well in kochia. It's starting to slip a little bit just with some of that 2,4-D insensitivity. But the Blackhawk EVO adding in that Duplosan was really just maintaining that control to the level that people were expecting out of Blackhawk in Western Canada. So it was really just to make sure that it was still going to work for people in Western Canada. A lot of it went out last year, looked really sharp. We were really happy with it last year. So just a few pictures of this was kind of out by Delisle, Saskatchewan, where you can just see the line where the sprayer stopped, and the koch on one side versus clean on the other, and as well as a field up in Stanmore that had a lot of resistance to different herbicides there, and just the Blackhawk EVO working really well on it there. This is just another picture of, this would have been applied in the fall of 2023. And this picture then would have been the spring of 2024. So this is that fall application, and even coming out, in May after that fall applied application, still, seeing that line in the fields where the Blackhawk EVO was compared to the Czechs. So where I like this picture too is, if you had done this and sprayed out in the fall, and say that you came back, you hadn't left a check strip, you'd come back in the spring, and the entire field just looked like that Blackhawk EVO side that was looking really clean. Would you go out and spray it again? And I think traditionally, a lot of us, myself included, would be tempted to say that something like, great, my fall herbicide worked, I can just seed, or maybe I'll just do half a rel of glyphosate or something and go seed, something like that. And I'd kind of like to challenge us to think a little more, like this, because from what we looked at earlier, there's probably 14 million plants in that quarter of whatever weed you're targeting, and any survivor is going to be at risk to create that problem. So I'd really like it if we could shift the mindset a little more to, great, my fall herbicide worked. Now I can just put down a straight residual herbicide, pick something that's just that residual, help keep that field clean, and limit any seed production that comes from those escapes. I know a lot of you probably, or if you were sitting up in a balcony watching this, would have a response of, sure, the guy that works for the chem company is telling me to spray more, which is totally fair. But the reality is, if you can do this and take advantage of all these opportunities to control those weeds, it can really help you to get some of these populations under control in a hurry. So this is just a field from last year. It was a lentil field. The entire field had, really good multi-mode of action burn down with a good shot of glyphosate. It had that good in-crop application. Ended up had some desiccation as well. But really the only difference between some of these areas in the field is that, this section had that fall applied Valteri Z, use that good straight residual that works really well in some of those koch populations compared to something that, was less of a residual product. So, really the only difference of adding in some of those soil residuals being a little more unpredictable to some of those weeds, get a different type of herbicide in, a different mode in there can really make a big difference to, at the end of the year to really help out all those products and really help them shine. So, when we do look at controlling some of those weeds, it really does take a strategy. So especially something like a kochia, really takes that season-long approach. So, and really rotate those modes of action and hit those weeds every opportunity you can. So, get out there with the post-harvest application, get on that soil residual, get on that pre-seed burn down, and really help out that in-crop where you can rotate and get different modes of action in there as well. It's really going to go a long ways to helping control it. And, it does kind of tend to take a 3 or 4 year program, which, can be really time consuming and expensive, and obviously things change with crop pricing and things like that too, and plans change. But really, if you can get on some of these acres and think of it as an investment that we all know those fields that have just got to be such a wreck, they just aren't productive anymore. And really, if you can attack this over a number of years with a plan and a strategy, you really can clean up a lot of those acres in a hurry. So even I was actually going to pull this through the other day. I'm surprised, we think of something like, pulses like our peas and our lentils that, we tend to think of them as kind of the crop with not a lot of herbicide options, but it's actually getting amazing now how many different, modes of action products there are out there in a lot of these different timings, to control weeds and even some of those pulses. So, obviously I have to promote the Nufarm. I wear my Nufarm hat, but mix and match, your favorite products in here from other companies. If you really like, whatever it is, product X, sub that in. But, you are able to get kind of 8 different, active or 8 different modes of action, across 8 different, across all these different timings in those pulses to help control those weeds. And, And it's the same kind of thing with canola. I think myself included, tend to think, I'm growing Liberty this year, so that's my herbicide option, or I'm growing, Roundup Ready this year, so that's my herbicide option. But, really across all these different timings, you can get quite a few different, modes of action in on that acre every year. So, if you look at some of the residuals and burn down in crop, you really can get a lot of different modes of action to help control those, whatever your challenging weeds are in your field, across that year. So and just a few examples, other examples of this working, so Ransack would be, our kind of product, the same actives as like a Viper, kind of a Bentazon, a Mazamox, and what tends to work really well. Missed a few things in here, but generally, worked pretty well this trial we had. But even better if you can get in there with Fierce and follow it up with Goldwing, follow that up with that Ransack. Now we've got a really clean field. It's got 6 active ingredients from 5 different groups, and kind of some contact and residuals and systemic modes of action that's really helping to clean up that field in a hurry. Just another example of in this case this was Fierce before some peas, and hopefully it shows up, but there's kind of some light patches here are the wild oats. And so Fierce is suppression only of wild oats, but it, adding those different modes of action to help keep those wild oats small and control some of those populations and keep them down can just really help out your in-crop applications. So, in this case, with some of the resistance they were dealing with wild oats and the peas, the in-crop application did a decent job, but it's just that much better if you can layer some of those herbicides and really help to keep those weeds under control and hit them at different times. So, and really, if you can plan that herbicide rotation, across those different years. Again, this is just put together with Nufarm products, but yeah, I mean, mix and match. If there's something that you find really works well on your farm, substitute that in. But if you just look across kind of that 4-year rotation, if had this field or these quarters or this part of the farm that was really causing you headaches, to tackle that over a 4-year rotation, and you can get call it 7, 8, 9 different active ingredients on those fields every year. I can almost guarantee you that you'd really be able to clean up those fields in a hurry, if you really attacked over that rotation. So I guess that's what I'd like to leave you with is, in summary, if you've got some of those problem fields, just think about, how can I really take each opportunity in a unique way to get ahead of those problem weeds? Incorporate those different timings, those different modes of action, those different product types to really get control of it. So, and definitely, Duplisan and Oxbow and Blackhawk EVO can really be a great addition to those rotation plans. So with that, I left my email on here if you do have any questions or anything with that like that. I'll also be happy to answer any questions you have.
That's great. Thank you. I know one thing I've been hearing a lot in the last week, lots of guys saying, hey, if I'm in there seeding early enough, I don't have to spray because my kochia isn't up yet. And to those guys, I'd like to say I'm finding lots of kochia out there already. It's just hard to see because it's the same color as the soil. It's all purple and cold stressed, but it's there.
Yeah, no kidding. So, and that if you miss it then it really gets to be a challenge once it's a monster, once you leave it and get back in with the in crop for sure.
Yeah, it's easy to kill when it's small like this, but to try to get in there, now you
Yeah.
see the cereal in there and it takes it 2 weeks to get out of the ground because the ground is cold. How big is that kochia going to be by the time you're at 4 leaf?
Yeah,
It's
no
it's
kidding.
going to be big.
Yeah.
Then you're going to need enforcer for sure. Yeah,
Yeah, no kidding.
yeah. I did use some oxbow last year, so my input on that was we used it on some fields, like specifically it was feedlot fields where we were really having trouble with kochia in manure,
Mhm.
and it did a really good job. We actually used it at the high rate on irrigation, and it was the first time in probably 4 or 5 years where we didn't have green kochia along the edges of the field at harvest. So the customer was really impressed with it. It did very well. We used the standard rate on the dry land, did really good. It was sprayed with an older sprayer without sectional control. We did see a little bit of stress in some of the corners at the high rate where we got overlap, but
Great.
overall, it was a really good product.
Yeah, good stuff. Glad to hear it. Yeah, no, we had a really, really big launch last year and yeah, generally worked really well. So we were definitely happy with it last year too. And yeah, looking forward to it again this year.
Hmm. Sounds good. Any other questions from anybody here? You can unmute yourselves and ask away if you want. Well, it's usually a quiet bunch. Well, with that, then we will be. I'll be stopping the recording here. So thank you very much for taking part and watching. Customers, don't go anywhere. We're going to do a draw afterwards here once I stop the recording. So thank you very much to Tyler, Evan, and Tanner from Nufarm.
Thanks for having us.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Lyle.
No problem at
Yeah,
all. All
thanks
right.
a lot,
Thank
Tyler.
you.